we're talking. So,
You're fine.
okay. Yeah.
Hello,
There's
everyone.
more of a delay.
It's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. That beautiful person was Elizabeth Lea Vos. We were having a conversation about what was taking place with regards to WikiLeaks. So I'm late, and I dramatically apologize to her for being late.
Not a problem at all.
Oh, thank you very much. She's extremely too kind. But I wanted to bring her onto the show because I've been following the developments of WikiLeaks, meaning I've been following what's been taking place from the standpoint of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and what's in the Ecuadorian embassy, meaning they cut him off from communications. And it seems like the Ecuadorian government has started to move closer to the United States. And there's a fear that they may be potentially going to hand him over. Elizabeth, can you give us an update? So the last time we talked, it was just after a court case. And they were trying to get the court case, I think, to try to get it either tossed out or at the very least to try to expose if there was a warrant behind what they were trying to hold him for.
Yeah. Yeah, and they, unfortunately, since we last talked, at that time, at least Julian Assange had access to the internet and phone calls, and he could have visitors. But at that time, yes, his legal counsel had attempted to have the basically the skipping bail issue. They wanted to have that thrown out because the allegations that it was based on had been dropped. And that was unsuccessful, which a lot of people thought was really awful because, as you mentioned, they thought that it was basically to cover for a U.S. extradition and like a secret charge against him or against WikiLeaks. So, yeah, that was the last time we spoke. And now Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno has actually ordered the embassy to cut off his communications, his access to the internet, his phone calls, and he's not allowed visitors, which is horrendous. And there's been just a very, fast-moving story that has developed over the last, month. I believe he's been the current count of the number of days that he's been cut off, and in basically the equivalent of solitary confinement is now 50 days, and that's really, really long. It's, for that type of condition, that is an extremely long time.
Why did they cut off his communications? I've heard two stories. I've heard one having to do with him commenting on Catalonia, the Spanish election. And the other one I heard something to do with him, something with the election, him commenting on some kind of election or something. What was the real story behind that? What was the reason why they gave him the pretext for cutting him off in his communications?
Yeah, the pretext that they published in an official government statement very shortly after they cut his communications were that basically they said that his Twitter statements were allegedly interfering with their relationship with other states, and that was by their account, that was his tweets that included his tweets about Catalonia and the unfair imprisonment of the Catalonian leader. Mm-hmm. But I think at this stage, I think we're all pretty aware that that isn't that superficial reasoning is not probably the real answer. And while we can't specifically definitely say, point to one reason and say this is why, I think, it was really interesting to see the Ecuadorian government shortly after they cut off Julian Assange's communications make a deal with the US, which was a military deal, and it's expected to see a US military presence in the Ecuadorian state that has not been there under the previous president, Rafael Correa, who had been very supportive of Assange's asylum. So there seems to be some definite, we would assume that there would be a huge amount of pressure on the Ecuadorian government. And this seems to have been, a recent, change in tone because the current president, Lenin Moreno, who made this deal and who ordered Assange's communications to be shut off previously, like just a few months ago at the beginning of the year, gave Julian Assange citizenship. He gave him diplomatic immunity, and he was, it looked like they were very much trying to get him free and out of the embassy. So to see this turnaround so quickly, we can't say exactly why, but it's very concerning to see that happen.
That's what I thought. So I was in Ecuador, I think it was last year. Lovely country, lovely people. The place was awesome. Difficult to breathe the air just because it's so high up. And I felt this thing of, yeah, you guys are doing God's work. Like that was the way I felt. It's like you guys are doing great protecting him in the way that you have been able to protect him from this kind of rapacious, corporate or governmental power, in this case, him revealing information. What changed? Was the deal the only thing that changed? My last experience with this, or the last thing I remember was Ecuadorian citizenship, because I thought the whole point of giving him the Ecuadorian citizenship was to try to create a pathway for him to be able to get to Ecuador.
Exactly.
So is the military deal the only thing that changed? in the process. I don't like. It's one thing. It would make sense if it was a completely different president, or if there was some kind of different change of political leaders, something like that. But it seems like, is that deal the only thing that's taken place that's been overt and over the top that can get across this kind of incentive for a certain amount of leverage? Like, I guess what I mean is, I give an example. Donald Trump is threatening Europe, essentially threatening the UK, saying he's going to try to increase their drug costs. I mean, this is the dumbest thing in the planet. I mean, the man is incompetent. But he's saying, you guys are skating on low-cost drugs. Well, yeah, because their government is bright enough to negotiate for the cost of the drugs. But he's trying to say, in any deal with Britain, meaning Britain wants a deal, he's going to try to use the leverage of that deal to try to get them to raise their drug costs. It's the dumbest thing on the planet. Yeah. But for somewhere like Ecuador, is it also possible that any kind of deal with the United States came with this thing of leverage and pressure, especially on that very specific point?
I think that that's definitely a possibility. There are probably a lot of realities going on behind the scenes that we just simply cannot definitively know exactly what they are. It could be some sort of combination of, offering money. It could be some sort of combination of threats as well. We just don't know. And so that is always going to be speculation on that specific aspect of it. But I think that other than the U.S. military deal with the Ecuadorian government, there's not a lot to go on that's in the public realm as far as a specific moment that their specific other reason that their outlook towards Assange changed. Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to think a minute to anything else I can think of that's.
And by the way, has anyone seen him recently? I mean, they've cut off even people visiting him, right?
Yeah, they have definitely. And that's one of the really harsh aspects of this. And that's what makes it effectively solitary confinement, is they absolutely have stopped all visitors with the one singular exception of his legal counsel. He cannot make a phone call to his mother. He can't speak to anyone. So the only thing that we can do if his supporters want to contact him is they can send letters and they can send postcards to the Ecuadorian embassy, but that's it. So it's a really unfortunate situation.
Wow. Can you tell some of the stories that were broken because of WikiLeaks and Assange? I try to get across the level, like the gravity of his influence and his impact in regards to our world. I mean, like the whole thing of mass surveillance. It's like, yeah, people might have known mass surveillance, but they didn't realize the scope and the level of the mass surveillance. Like he's been dramatically important to this thing of truth in regards to our world around us. What have been some of the things that WikiLeaks have been able to introduce to the public that the public either didn't know or didn't know the scale of? I'm trying to get across the value of Assange and his I guess his relevance, his significance as a person and what he's been pushing and striving for.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things is that there are so many different issues that WikiLeaks touches. I mean, just from the perspective of disobedient media, there are so many stories that we have written that would have been impossible or would have been much weaker if we didn't have WikiLeaks documents to basically strengthen our findings, or they were based on them entirely. So issues as far apart from each other as the DNC fraud lawsuit or the DNC fraud issue, that would never have been exposed if it wasn't for WikiLeaks. There's a lot of human trafficking cases that we've reported on that were very much supported by WikiLeaks information. And then, so just at one outlet, you have, multiple different topics that we've used WikiLeaks documents to back our reporting up with. But then you had all of the other different independent media outlets that have also used WikiLeaks information. And basically, the importance to WikiLeaks, from my perspective, is that not only that they have revealed, these horrific war crimes, with the video of collateral murder and all of that, but also that I believe that without WikiLeaks, independent media could not exist in the way that it does, in the way that it has flourished, if it wasn't for the WikiLeaks documents and information that we're able to access. I think that they have basically given independent media and independent journalists the evidence to then report on. And I think that without that, we would be much, much weaker in our reporting on so many different topics. And just recently, when I wrote an article just about the Guardian having smeared Julian Assange, one of the things that I noted was that according to WikiLeaks itself, journalists, and I think the phrase they used was academic papers and US court cases had cited WikiLeaks the number of those cases and academic papers that had cited WikiLeaks documents was 28,000. And I checked it, and it had doubled actually between when they said that it had was 28,000 and the present. It's up to now like 43,000. So that is the type of impact. It's not just journalism, it's court cases, it's academic papers. They have absolutely changed the world and revolutionized journalism as well.
That's amazing. I mean, even something as mundane, like I use a scale of, you know, this kind of mass surveillance and everything else, but even something as mundane as the way the media interacts with political campaigns. Like how there would be certain people behind the scenes that would essentially take a story from a politician, and then how the way the politician can kind of manipulate the media by working behind the scenes with these journalists. You know, there was one guy I remember, I think it was WikiLeaks, revealed kind of the person said, look, I'm going to get in good with the Bernie camp, and then later on I'm going to come out as saying we need to support Clinton. That's amazing.
Yeah,
like, that's
absolutely.
That's mind-blowing. Now, it's not so much mind-blowing that the person would do it. I would imagine that if you're a Clintonite or a Clinton supporter, you're trying to use these kind of political games. But it's one thing to think it. It's another thing to be able to read it with your own eyes and say, this is what these people be doing behind the scenes in order to try to manufacture consent or to try to get people over into a particular thing. Hey, I was a Sanders supporter. I mean, look at my old articles about supporting Sanders. And now, you know, it's time where we need to support Hillary Clinton. Like
absolutely.
That type of stuff. Like it's amazing, but you would not have known that without WikiLeaks.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say that I think a lot of the Bernie supporters, I mean, I think we take for granted sometimes the effect that WikiLeaks has had, because a lot of us, and I was a Bernie Sanders supporter too, but if we had not had those WikiLeaks documents showing us that you know, corruption in the DNC that was totally favoring Clinton over Sanders, without the WikiLeaks documents showing that, we would have been called conspiracy theorists. And we are still called conspiracy theorists by the mainstream press, but we have the evidence to show that they're obviously lying, and that this is obviously a corporate agenda to back Hillary. But again, if we didn't have that evidence, you know, we would have nothing to stand on except for our, you know, our gut feeling and our intuition, and you know, what we saw with our own eyes. So the validation that WikiLeaks provides cannot be, you know, overstated. It's really, really important. And it's important that we don't take that for granted, the service that they've done for all of us and the risks that WikiLeaks staff and that Julian Assange have undertaken on behalf of all of us, of the public of the entire planet, against corruption and against the harms of our own governments. So
I used to get into an argument with a guy I used to work with, and he used to be in the military. He used to some kind of intelligence work. And he was like, yeah, they need to just take him out back and put a bullet in him. And I was like, you're a fucking idiot. And I was like, fact is, how do you know what your government is doing if you're not able to see what your government is doing? Like, you have this philosophical responsibility to keep track of your government. You're supposed to control your government. You're supposed to be a government by the people, meaning the government itself is supposed to get its powers and authorities and everything else based on the people who are in that government. How on earth do you control that edifice if you don't know what that edifice is doing? And all of these guys have incentives to essentially hide their screw ups and hide their failings behind some kind of security or secrets. You know, if this is revealed, 1 million people are going to die. That type of stuff.
Yeah.
When you see it, I give you an example, the Nunes memo. When the Nunes memo came out, that's not Julian Assange, but Democrats, people are going to die if you release that information. And it was the most mundane thing showing FBI corruption.
Exactly.
But from their argument, people are going to die. The memo released, nobody says anything else. They keeps going.
Exactly.
Like, but that's the argument they've consistently used against Julian Assange. Oh, this guy's going to hurt somebody. Oh, this guy's going to kill somebody. Oh, this guy's just releasing information. And it's like, but he's releasing information, explaining to you what's taking place behind the scenes with your government, your own government, what your government is doing. How can you not want to know that? And not just not want to know that. How can you not take on the responsibility that someone endowed upon you by being a citizen of this country and paying attention to what that information is? Because that information should dictate what you think and what you do. It's journalism. I mean, it's
exactly.
It's real journalism.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what it boils down to.
Yeah, and to see a journalist, and this is what blows my mind too, because, you know, we indie journalists, you know, we look at this from a different perspective of these, you know, corporate media reporters, but to see a journalist like Julian Assange and a journalistic outlet like WikiLeaks persecuted in this way, and then to not only persecuted and suffering in this way, but also by our former CIA director, Mike Pompeo, compared directly to a terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda. To see that tells you not only the threat that our intelligence community sees WikiLeaks as, but it also tells you how effective they are as a journalistic organization. So I think it's really, really perilous, the situation they're in right now. And I think that we, the public that benefit from WikiLeaks, need to step up and support them any way we can. And that doesn't have to be just donations. That can be attending vigils, sharing stuff on social media, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of different ways people who don't have the money to donate can definitely help their cause. So
you said The Guardian smeared him. So I saw a bit of it. I didn't get the chance to read the entirety of the article. I saw I'm on Twitter. I'm on WikiLeaks Twitter thing. And I saw WikiLeaks put up like a little blurb saying that The Guardian essentially lied, or The Guardian was saying something that wasn't necessarily true, and WikiLeaks was trying to debunk it. What was that? Because that's weird, because The Guardian was one of those outlets that was publishing that information and WikiLeaks used, right? I mean, it's like, thank you for the information, but now we're going to smear you.
Yeah, there's actually a really long history of The Guardian sort of backstabbing leakers, independent journalists, and WikiLeaks. Julian Assange, I believe he published in 2015, he published an article, an op-ed article with Newsweek that discussed the way in which The Guardian had mishandled the entire Snowden issue. And then on top of that, he specifically talked in that article, he wrote about Luke Harding, who he referred to as a plagiarist, and who actually had won a Plagiarist of the Year award. And so, so he talked about that a little bit. And it's interesting to see, not only does The Guardian then publish the smear, but it's written, one of the authors, there were a number of authors, but one of them was Luke Harding again. And not only that, not only do you have, and I think it's also fair to point out that Luke Harding wrote a book which literally is profiting from the Trump-Russia collusion narrative. So I think he sees WikiLeaks as someone who is directly opposed to his financial interests.
I know that guy. That's the guy who Aaron Matei obliterated. It's that the
yes, and and the other thing,
obliterated that guy.
Yeah.
Oh, so, it was embarrassing.
Exactly.
It was so embarrassing.
So The Guardian set themselves up for failure by allowing him to even be remotely involved. But even worse, like it gets worse than that. So Luke Harding actually used a source who previously had been shown to have given The Guardian forged documents, which they then published. So you've got Luke Harding, who is a problematic journalist, and then you have a source that is problematic too. So the entire story should be taken with a massive grain of salt. And this morning, today, Glenn Greenwald published an exclusive interview with in The Intercept with Rafael Correa, who was the previous Ecuadorian president, and he called out the Guardian smear as basically rubbish and said that it was sensationalized and completely, basically untrue, et cetera, et cetera. So
wait, what was the smear? You didn't tell what the smear was. What was the what were they accusing him of? I saw something with Ecuador. I just didn't know what it was. What was the smear itself that they were accusing him of?
So they were alleging a number of things. They said, one, that the Ecuadorian government had spied on Julian Assange and had recorded all of his interactions with his lawyers, which is a really serious thing, as well as all visitors who came to see him. They also alleged that Julian Assange had hacked into the communications of the embassy and its staff. So they really tried to make him into this like Bond-esque, villain, as opposed to the journalist who's being persecuted, So it was really sickening to read that, for sure. They're trying to say he hacked in while he was in the embassy? Yes. Yeah, they're trying to say that he hacked into basically the communications of the staff. And in that way, they were trying to portray him as meddling in the affairs of state. And then additionally, they also manipulated the cost of policing the embassy and tried to make that Assange's fault. And we all know that it's because that cost is really because the US wants to extradite Julian Assange and all of that. So they very much manipulated the reality and the facts of this situation in order to make Assange, look like a villain, and also to make, I think, to try to encourage the Ecuadorian government to stop protecting him. And I think that's really unfortunate.
And that's where the conspiracy theory stuff came in, where they were saying that a conspiracy theory is being generated in order to try to get him out of the embassy. Essentially, they're trying to use that as kind of leverage to get him out. Like, look how much money these guys spent, and it's all Julian Assange's fault. And it's like, well, not so much. Britain is doing this in order to at the behest of the United States. There's a potential for a warrant, sitting behind the scenes. Britain can let him walk out to Ecuador, but they're not going to let him walk out to Ecuador. That's on them.
Exactly. And I mean, legally, they should have earlier this year, he should have, by just international law, if the UK was willing to respect international law, he should have been able to safely walk out of the embassy when they gave him diplomatic status, because diplomatic immunity is very powerful. And there are diplomats throughout, recent history that have done very, very illegal things and have not been prosecuted because of that status. And so the fact that he was not able to actually get safe passage to Ecuador earlier this year when he had that shows you that the UK police forces and the UK government are not going to let him go, and it has nothing to do with bail or the allegations that came from Sweden. It has everything to do with his work, his effective work as a journalist.
Is someone else carrying on his work while he's at the embassy itself? I know WikiLeaks is still going on, but is there, and there are two parts to this question. One of the things I read showed that the ability or the way that cash was being given to Assange, or the way that WikiLeaks was being supported by cash, was being changed. The argument that WikiLeaks was making was, we're still under assault by the CIA and intelligence services. So whatever that program is that Julian Assange started in order to get cash in this kind of anonymous way, that was somehow, they were removing WikiLeaks from the list of being able to do that. Do you know what I'm talking about on this?
Yes, the Freedom of the Press Foundation was founded because of the blockade, the financial blockade enforced by PayPal and a number of other companies against WikiLeaks to hurt them financially. That took place in 2010, and at the time, WikiLeaks said that damaged 95% of their revenue. Obviously, at this time there is not the same economic blockade going on. But one really important thing to remember is that, and this was pointed out specifically by Susie Dawson in her amazing work, Being Julian Assange, which I edited for her and with her. So I learned a lot as I went through and read her work, really closely. And so one of the things that really came out was that the importance of Freedom of the Press Foundation and the reason it was founded was not only because or for the benefit of WikiLeaks, it was also to protect the identity and the privacy of its American donors. Because at the time, PayPal and et cetera would not have protected those donors. And they were afraid that basically people in the US might have faced retribution if their identities were passed on to government that they had donated to WikiLeaks. So that's another really huge thing that was dropped by the Freedom of the Press Foundation when they stopped handling the US donations to WikiLeaks. They are also allowing those people to be in a more dangerous situation, more precarious and less private situation when they donate from the US. And the US is the biggest donor base for WikiLeaks, so it's really important to keep that up.
That weirded me out with this, because Glenn Greenwald is on the board of this, and apparently it required a unanimous vote. Why would Glenn Greenwald vote on behalf of this? I mean, he seems to always have been this kind of stalwart supporter of WikiLeaks. What changed?
Well, I believe that he is, and I think Susie Dawson is the best person to ask about this because she has more familiarity with that specific part of this. But I think from what she wrote in her article, she basically described the fact that this was not an easy decision. That the board of the Freedom of the Press Foundation spent over a year fighting about this specific issue, and they also had one really important member of the board resign because of what was going on. So this wasn't something where Glenn Greenwald just easily went along with this. I think I don't question Glenn Greenwald's integrity on this subject. I mean, just today he published a fantastic article, that interview with Rafael Correa. So I think that it was a very, very difficult decision for them to make, but I still very strongly disagree with their decision. And I think there were a few,
I'm just curious about why, if that makes sense. Like, it's clearly they're still targeted. Clearly, he's still sitting in an embassy, and if they can get their hands on him, they're going to get their hands on him. They're going to do whatever they need to do to get their hands on him. It just seems a little weird that they all of a sudden just stopped. Let me ask you this: is it possible that they believe that they themselves, like, the heat was too much, like that the organization itself was going to come under fire if they remained supportive of Assange? In which case, they thought it might have been better for the organization as a whole to pull back support, or am I just way off on this?
Basically, no, I think that it's a very complicated situation because there are some members of that board originate from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, or the EFF, and that gets into a really complicated relationship between, some personalities that really truly emotionally dislike Julian Assange, and I'm referring in this case to Michael Lee. I think he was a really strong voice against continuing the protection of the Freedom of the Press Foundation for WikiLeaks. So I think part of it was a clash of personalities, and then part of it was, perhaps. I think basically to explain this, you have to recognize that there is an all of government effort to destroy WikiLeaks, to attack their financial standing, et cetera, et cetera. So I would imagine that people on that board also would have had a lot of pressure on them, from various interests. So I can't get into specifics on that. I would ask your viewers to go read Susie Dawson's article because she covers this subject in really great detail, and she gets into some of the personalities that are involved in that entire event.
Law, the legality of this.
Yeah.
My mom, I was talking to her earlier today about this when I was telling her I was bringing you on for an interview. She was like, so who are you bringing on today? I was like, yeah, Elizabeth Vos, she's coming on. And I was explaining WikiLeaks and everything else. And once I said Julian Assange, she says, oh, I know who that is. Like, it clicked.
Yeah.
I was explaining to her everything that was taking place, the kind of locking him in the embassy and all this other stuff, cutting communications. And how Britain, for the most part, said, well, we're keeping you in here because you broke the law by not letting us lock you up, even though the other charges have been dropped. And she says, where's the legality of this? This is illegal. This is an amazing question. What law would the United States be using if they tried to drag Julian Assange back to the United States?
It's difficult to really pinpoint, but I think that they would charge him with espionage, I think. And I believe that's and John Kiriakou on the first online vigil that we did to reconnect Julian, like the day that the Ecuadorian government cut his communications, we had an amazing array of individuals who participated in that vigil. And one of them was John Kiriakou, and he's a CIA whistleblower who blew the whistle specifically on the CIA's illegal, basically the torture program that they were running. So because he has been prosecuted by this same apparatus, and he actually spent 2 years in prison as a result of his whistleblowing activity, he has a lot of experience, both obviously working in the CIA, but also with the legal process that comes at you when you whistleblow. And it's, side note, it's really disgusting that, the only person that was prosecuted in connection with this illegal program was the person who blew the whistle on it. So
that's amazing, right? That's
it's totally awful. But so he has that experience. And so he was saying that they would try him in I believe it was the Eastern Court of Virginia. And he called it the espionage court because nobody who has been prosecuted there has ever won their case because, the jury is made up of people from this district that is heavily, if they're not part of the intelligence community themselves, and their family is, and et cetera. Their entire community is really, based and soaked in the intelligence community. And so you are not going to win a case there at all. So that was what John Kiriakou basically said. That's a kind of a paraphrase of what he expressed. But I think that, basically we have to understand that the law is being used now in such a way that is not on the side of right. It's not on the side of justice. It's really, really a perverse use of the justice system to attack WikiLeaks and Julian Assange because they are journalists and they should be respected as journalists who are doing a fantastic job.
I argue there's no such thing as international law. That stuff is used purely as a club.
Exactly.
Like the stronger countries, for the most part, can just ignore it and blow past it. The weaker countries, for the most part, have to deal with the larger countries imposing that international law. So if the United States wants to do something, it just blows past the law. It pays no attention to it. Nobody's going to do anything about it. If some podunk country in Ghana, or Ghana does it, well, they're going to drag that guy before the Hague. It's used purely as a club. It's not a real thing per se, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking in a larger sense, you can see it when, when the US makes these really aggressive statements about Syria and Iran, talking about humanitarian interest, and then they turn around and they're supporting Saudi Arabia committing a genocide in Yemen and killing hundreds and thousands of children. So I think we definitely see that in a very large an array of subjects and areas. That type of hypocrisy is something that's really real. And again, returning to WikiLeaks, they are the ones who have principally exposed that, more than anybody else. They have been the ones who have given us evidence of that hypocrisy. So
I want to ask, how does this end? And there's no way for you to know that. And so I asked the question kind of in this kind of expansive way. And I'm going to ask something else. His mom has been very active in pushing
Definitely.
to try to get, I guess, some kind of support to help her son. Because you can imagine, you know, you have a kid, that kid, the United States government is after that kid because that kid is trying to produce truth and information and give the public real information. Like, it's trying to give them something that says, look, this is behind the scenes. This is what these guys are doing behind the scenes. This is the power structure in play. This is how it looks. And even though he can't necessarily get his hands on everything, but at the very least, he allows a forum for people whose conscience is bugging them to get information out, to say this is what's taking place around the world. I would imagine his mom is on wit's end. Like, she's been taking some extreme steps, and she's been getting flack for this. There's been some really disgusting people saying things to her, talking about, he can walk out anytime he wants, and all this other stuff. How do we help? Like, so if I guess I always feel powerless in these type of situations, or the spirit. How does anybody assist in this case? How do you help? How do you get across angst or being pissed off, or at the very least, how do you do anything to help his plight in that embassy?
Yeah, well, I think that, Julian Assange has done an incredible job advocating for her son. And for any of your viewers who want to go follow her, she is a great source, as you said. She's a fantastic source of information on how you can help. Like, she's always listing the address of the embassy for people to write postcards to. She's listing the specific political figures that people should write letters of support to Assange to try and affect the situation. And she has a lot of different, ideas about vigils that people can be a part of. So her account on Twitter is at Assange, ASSANGE Mrs. MRS. So Assange Mrs. is the Twitter handle of Julian Assange. And so, the pronunciation sometimes confuses people. So I wanted to spell it out. But yeah, so that's her account. You should definitely follow it. And yes, there has been some really horrific attacks on her, which I wrote about in a CMIT post. And the reason that that's interesting too, just as a side note, is because it's always somebody who is connected to either the intelligence community or the Clinton camp. And so it's really not an organic sentiment. It is not something that the actual public really feels. It is the backlash of the powerful who are exposed by WikiLeaks, who make those types of absolutely rank, disgusting comments towards her. But I want to say as well that Julian Assange, from what I have seen, is not only a fantastic human being, she's incredibly brave. So those comments seem to just not affect her whatsoever. And I think that when those comments did happen, her response basically was try harder. She's been up against so much more than that a few comments on Twitter really do not seam to bother her, which is fantastic.
Yeah, you can't let it bother you. It's your kid. I mean, you're going to advocate for your kid to the degree that you can advocate for your kid. A weird question. So there was an interview where Julian Assange is having a conversation. I can't remember the person who's talking. I think maybe in Dutch. And Julian Assange brings up saying Seth Rich, just out of the blue, which kind of puts everybody's ears like, what? Did you just say that? I mean, why are you bringing that up within the context of people being injured and everything else? We don't know who the leaker is. And I think it's nonsense, the mainstream media, the narrative that they've gone with, this Russia hacking nonsense. Yeah. And beyond Russian hacking nonsense, I think is nonsense. The Britain story. So one of the guys, I can't think of his name. What is his name? Can't think of his name. I can see his face. I can't think of his name. But he comes out saying that Christopher Steele worked with Pablo Miller, who was also part of MI6. And there's this hypothesis that Skripal was essentially the source for the Trump dossier, meaning the Russian source that Clinton got this information from. Christopher Steele, being the Brit, working with Pablo Miller, who was essentially the handler for Skripal. Like, they were making a point that these things might be connected in the way that these things are connected, but instead they use the Trump-Russia thing as almost this kind of obfuscation from this stuff. What do you think about that? So I have to be honest. I always look at it as, is it possible that somebody who worked for the DNC leaked information from the DNC? Yes, of course. Do I know it? No, I don't. Do they know that he didn't do it? No, they do not. And if they're saying that they know he didn't do it, they're lying through their teeth. And the one person who would know is on television using this in context of leaking documents and leaking information. Any comment on that? And I don't mean to get into the full, that Hillary Clinton had him rubbed off. Now,
yeah, no,
I don't get that far into it. I mean, my thing goes into, is it possible that somebody who worked for the DNC passed information on the DNC? Yes.
Absolutely. And I think that the other thing about that is that basically the establishment media in the US especially has done a fantastic job at making the name Seth Rich radioactive. And I think that's a shame.
It's so bizarre.
They've been very effective at making that an unbroachable topic.
Yeah, but it's insane. Yeah. Like it's their narrative. They create these narratives that when you really think about, don't really make much sense. Like, so they would say, the Syrian government, Bashar al-Assad gasses his own people. And you're like, but why? He has 90-something% of his territory cleared. What reason would he have to do that? Well, he's just a bad guy.
You just should believe.
Yeah.
Just believe what we say without critical thinking. Yeah, absolutely.
It's amazing. And the same thing with Seth Rich thing. The one person on this planet who would know who gave him the information brings up Seth Rich out of the blue. And the media says, oh, he's just doing that. Why? Like, why would you just randomly do that? It makes no sense.
I think the element of the unknown with Seth Rich is similar to the element of the unknown when we talk about why did Ecuador suddenly decide to cut off Assange's communications. There's that element there where we can speculate, but we cannot know. Yeah. And that's important to recognize. But I think that just based on the fact that the Russian hacking, specifically the hacking narrative, now the Trump-Russia collusion narrative is a whole other, can of worms that is just, also flimsy, but it's a separate subject. But as far as the hacking subject, they have been, the media, the establishment, and the DNC have contradicted themselves so many times on who hacked them, how they hacked them, etc., that the contradiction and the lack of evidence that they have provided, they have never given their servers to the authorities to check them. We're relying on the word of CrowdStrike, who worked for the DNC, who received $100 million from, a middleman company from Eric Schmidt's Alphabet. So there is a huge amount of issues with that, but ultimately what it comes down to is the fact that they have not proven that this happened. They have not proven with any evidence whatsoever that they were hacked. So that lack of evidence, because it would be so much in their interests to give us evidence if it really happened, I think that lack of evidence speaks very loudly, and it makes me, it persuades me that it is much more likely that the information that WikiLeaks published was leaked to them. It was not hacked and then given to them. And I absolutely trust them when they say that it did not come from a state party. So I think all of those things, just based on the evidence, not just my personal feelings about WikiLeaks or Hillary Clinton or the DNC, but just based on the evidence that is available to us, I think the leaking explanation is much more, it makes much more sense.
And now the DNC, these stupid idiots are suing WikiLeaks, Trump, and apparently Russia. This is amazing. Do you think that any level of discovery would essentially force them to hand over those servers? Man, you have no idea how much I wish this backfires, where it's like hand over.
I do too. Yeah, no, I think that it's amazing that they didn't see that coming. And so that makes me concerned at the same time that there may be some sort of way that they're going to, make this into a very unfair situation. But yeah, no, I think that from the way that WikiLeaks responded, they said that basically they had been sued once before by the Scientology, wing of things, and that had not gone well for the Scientologists. And so they said the same thing is going to happen with the DNC suing them. So I think that was a very bad move on the DNC's part. I'm not particularly too concerned about WikiLeaks on that issue. I am very concerned about Assange being in solitary confinement right now and the effect that has on him. But the lawsuit, I think, was more of a misstep on the DNC's part. Than it is WikiLeaks.
Somebody always has to take the lift. It doesn't matter what it is. If you're talking about civil rights, if you're talking about women's rights, if you're talking about workers' rights, somebody always takes the hit. And
that's very true.
Yeah, it's like, just because you do good doesn't necessarily mean good follows. You can be, you can do amazingly good things. I would make the argument that what Julian Assange has done from the standpoint of, from a humanistic standpoint of, you should know what your government and what your society is, truthfully, not the narratives, truthfully. Otherwise, you can't necessarily hold these people accountable. And yet, you take the hit for it. I mean, he's in this horrible situation where he's taking a hit. Let me ask you this. Is there anything else that's on this case that I haven't asked, either just because I didn't necessarily know to ask, or I have a bunch of stuff written down. But either just because I didn't necessarily know to ask or just necessarily didn't come up. Is there anything else that you would like to add on this particular issue?
Yeah, basically, I think that people should definitely keep an eye out on the hashtag Unity4J, and that's the number 4 and then the letter J, because I think that there will be continuous events going on under that hashtag that will continue where that first vigil left off, and so that will be a really great project to rally around as we move forward. I also wanted to add, just as far as how people can help, because I think that in addition to following Christine Assange and following her advice, people should donate specifically to the Julian Assange Legal Defense Fund. They should buy from the WikiLeaks shop if they can, and they can also donate to the website iamwikileaks.org, and there's a donation, just literally, search on any engine but Google, donate to WikiLeaks, and it'll come up. But for anyone who cannot donate, which is totally understandable in the age that we're in right now, what I suggest people to do is to take whatever talents they have. And I've said this like 3 times. I said it on Twitter, I've said it in interviews, but I want to say it again very clearly, that every single one of us has talents and tools available that we can use to help this fight. And it doesn't have to be writing or speaking. It can be anything from music to cooking and doing a bake sale, or networking and organizing, vigils and protests. Everyone has unique talents and gifts that can be re-engineered into helping this fight. And I think that the real stumbling block is not so much being talented or having a tool. It's actually in seeing what your ability and tool is. It's in really being creative in how you look at what you can do, and then using whatever you have available to fight in this effort. So
when someone has seen him, by the way, I know you said only one person is allowed to go back and see him. When is the last time somebody has visual contact with Assange?
Well, I think his lawyers are allowed to visit him. But okay, as far as I am aware, the last person who spoke with him in person was Cassandra Fairbanks. And that was just a couple of days or like under a week before he went into the embassy. And so, it's really important to know that don't believe the QAnon people when they say that he's out. That's really damaging to this whole issue, because he is in the embassy and he is suffering. No, I know you don't, but I'm just talking to your viewers who may be aware of that and may have sort of wanted to believe it, because it makes us feel better to think that he's not actually suffering, but he is, and that's why we really need to fight. I'm just trying to think of anything else that I may have missed.
QAnon is a goofball. I've seen 1 or 2 of the posts, and I don't quite understand why people.
Yeah.
It's like that Trump is playing like this 20-dimensional chess and all this other nonsense. Like he's fighting a globalist. Trump's not fighting anybody. He's filling a swamp full of alligators.
Exactly.
Let me ask you about that angle, the Trump angle. So
yeah,
every so often I do shows on UFO stuff because I'm fascinated by it. I think it's an amazing question just to even ponder it. And when you have the military coming out saying this type of stuff. Now, the catch is WikiLeaks had a bunch of information on that. Like from the Clinton campaign, Podesta and everything else, because, Podesta was heavy into this particular topic, trying to get the files open. When Clinton lost, it seems like a wrench was thrown into the plans of Tom DeLonge. Now, the reason why I bring this up, because Tom DeLonge, people thought Tom DeLonge was full of it. Tom DeLonge is the one who used to play for Blink 182. And he comes out and saying he's going to release these files and everything else. And you're like, yeah, whatever. And then WikiLeaks comes out. And they're like, holy shit, Tom DeLonge actually does have these contacts. Podesta, he has all these like military contacts, all of these people, all of these spooks who essentially Tom DeLonge was affiliated with. And so, Hillary Clinton loses. Now, Hillary Clinton had been open about saying she wants to open the book. She wants to open the files. WikiLeaks, again, publishes the information showing that the Hillary Clinton camp was trying to get talk show hosts to ask her about UFOs, like over and over and over again. I think it was like 2 or 3 people that she tried to get. And when somebody finally asked her, she was delighted that she was asked. And the people were gushing at how well she answered the question, because Hillary Clinton wanted to open the books. Hillary Clinton loses. Now, just because she loses doesn't necessarily mean that those things aren't necessarily in play. Tom DeLonge goes back and says, okay, well, give me a little bit longer. And all of a sudden, here you are, big splashy headlines, New York Times, Politico, I think it was Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, all at the exact same time. And they say,
you're talking about the UFO stuff that they published, right? Yeah.
Well,
very interesting. Yeah.
Now, I suspect that was because they thought Clinton was going to win, and that all of this stuff was just kind of going to flow right on together, where they're going to kind of push him along and everything else. So this gets me into this thing of Trump. Nobody necessarily knows where Trump fits in on this particular topic because, you know, he's incompetent. It's Trump. And we don't even necessarily know if Trump looks up when he walks. How does Trump relate to the Assange thing? Like, because we knew, I think at the very least we had some idea that Clinton wanted to put a bullet in Assange if she could get her hands on him. So what does the Trump administration think in this regard? Or do we even know how Trump sees this? Because let's be honest, if Trump wanted to get rid of the Russia stuff, he would make it a deal with Assange for free passage if he gives information showing that it wasn't Russia. That honestly, if it was me, I would do that tomorrow. I would say, I'm going to give him a pardon. Mind you, he's not an American citizen, so I don't necessarily know what that means. Or at the very least, I'm going to stop hounding him if we get evidence or if he gives evidence showing it's not the Russians. I would do that tomorrow. Because if I was Donald Trump, the last 2 years that the Democratic Party has been screaming this, so the last 2 years that the media has been screaming this, they will be all shown to be liars. And they've been, you know, screaming and wringing their hands about this stuff, which at the end of the day amounts to hooey. It's something essentially they made up and just ran with it. And you would find out that this is nonsense. Does Trump have a say in this? Or has Trump had any say in this so far?
That's a really great question. I think it's an interesting topic. I think that on the subject of the UFO issue, I think that people should definitely keep their eyes open very critically on how that is presented to them. So when you have something like the New York Times and all of these various organizations who are very much establishment bringing you this same narrative, I'm not saying that they're outright lying or anything like that, but just we should really keep our critical eye on that. And ask questions about why, about, you know, how and when, and all of those questions that journalists are supposed to ask. But
and by the way, let me interrupt real quick. I'm one of those people who have this thing of I'm fascinated by this subject, and the U.S. government has been studying this subject going back since the 40s, like for a long time. So the idea that all of a sudden, this is just like $12 million is a drop in the bucket. A lot of the story doesn't quite fit and doesn't quite make sense.
Exactly.
Especially with all the spooks and everything else. These guys have been lying to the UFO community for God knows how long, and all of a sudden all these spooks just kind of come out with their hands in the sun. I am greatly concerned about this, if I'm being honest. I initially met this story with a certain amount of, oh, good, kind of. They're coming out with this information. Yeah, finally, exactly. It's coming out, you know, they can have this conversation. I don't understand why this is not a decent conversation that people have in normal circumstances. But then you're like, he surrounded himself with all these spooks. And is it possible that they're talking about this stuff from threats and weapon systems, and we need something? Exactly. That's my problem with this. Yeah. All of this boils down
it's the next payday for the arms dealers and arms corporations, you know, Raytheon, et cetera, et cetera. If we create this giant existential threat, then we need giant spending on weapons, space weapons, and all the rest. Yeah, so I think that would be the angle that I would be watching out for very much.
That's exactly what I think, and it terrifies me because it's
and that's totally separate from the actual reality of whatever happens or not. You know, whatever. It's like that. I think that those are kind of two separate things. You have to just keep your criticism alive and well in looking at this. I don't think it's as simple as they're telling the truth or they're not, you know? So.
Yeah, I agree. Oh man, I totally agree with you on this. When this first came out, I was excited. I was like, "Oh, this is awesome! This is awesome! This is fascinating!" And then I'm watching one of the what's his name, Lou. I can't think of his last name, but the one who ran the program, Elizondo. And I'm watching CNN, and the woman asked him. She says, "So, do you think?" Like she's like blown away by it. So, do you think they're aliens? I mean, do you think there are people coming here? And he says, "Well, I can't speak for the U.S. government, but yes." And this blows her mind. And I'm sitting here like, oh my God, this guy just confirmed it. He just confirmed it. And then there's like a hamburger commercial that comes on next. And I'm like, oh, this is so mundane compared to what this guy just said. And then as time goes on, you start to realize all of these guys are spooks. Yeah. And not just spooks. All of this is cut in the sense of weapons and threats. And there's something in our airspace. And we need to do something about our airspace. All this stuff. And you're like, you gave me 3 shady videos, and now you're telling me that there's some threat that we need to be, get concerned about and get more weapons and technology and all this other stuff. So, yeah. But I'm sorry, that's a digression. What's the Trump angle on this story?
I think what the fact that, during the election, during the campaign, we all remember seeing Trump saying, "I love WikiLeaks" on the campaign trail. I mean, that was a famous speech. So then to turn around and as he's, when he's president, when he's in office, he is unable or unwilling to help Julian Assange. And I think that there are two really unfortunate realities that we're seeing here. One is that the unfortunate reality that I think is most disturbing is that right now, Trump is Julian Assange's best hope for getting out. If he pardons him, that is the most likely way that this could effectively be solved. So I think that the pro WikiLeaks people, some of them, as much as they dislike Trump personally, you need to be addressing Trump to try and get him to help Assange out of this specific situation. But the other part of this, the other really unfortunate thing is I think that it shows us how little power the president, whoever the president is, has, especially on foreign policy, because what you're seeing is this total turnaround from the campaign trail Trump to the President Trump, who is now, who's with Attorney General Jeff Sessions saying that it is a top priority to get Assange, with Mike Pompeo, when he was CIA director, saying, comparing WikiLeaks to a terrorist organization. So what you're seeing, I believe, is that Trump on this issue is totally powerless, I think, when it comes to, Assange, when it comes to foreign policy. And I think that this is a similar kind of backpedaling that we saw a number of presidents do when they promised they would do such and such. And, then they just turn around and did the exact opposite. I think that this is showing us the strength of the unelected power structure in Washington, D.C., and the strength of our intelligence community when compared to our president. I think that the honest truth about this is that the president does not have as much say as we thought that they might. So their campaign promises, especially on issues around foreign policy and war spending, and then espionage and or intelligence, related subjects. On those issues, I think that no matter who is in power, they have a lot less say than we would like them to. And that is an unfortunate reality that we all have to wake up to. I hope that makes sense. But
no, I understand what you mean. Like, essentially, whatever the president wants to do is somewhat constrained by the factors that are around the president. There's certain offices and everything else. Is it possible?
I'm not trying to excuse him, though. I'm not trying to excuse him. I'm just saying I think we're seeing that.
I guess I look at it as, you have a reality show host who's president of the United States, and you have some guy who walks into a room and tells him, look, we need to do this or people are going to die. What is the reality show host going to do? The reality show host fires a bunch of has-been celebrities for years. That's his experience. He's been one failed business after the next, regardless of what Donald Trump says, meaning regardless of the bravado and everything else. Donald Trump knows he's a reality show host. Donald Trump knows that he's incompetent. And I say that, yes, I'm saying that to be brutal, because Donald Trump is essentially, there's 58 people that's been murdered based on the behavior that he has taken. And it's not just him. All the other presidents had promised to move, I think, to Jerusalem, but he himself made the decision to do it. And again, Democrats wring their hands, but you have many of the Democrats who are on board with him doing this. They just didn't necessarily want to be the ones who had their fingerprints on it. So when I'm calling him incompetent, I'm being an asshole. But in this case, I do
totally great with me. I don't mind. I mean, it's the same thing. Like you talk about Jerusalem, though. I think it's really interesting too. Like a similar issue to that is his recent nomination of Gina Haspel, who is a war criminal, to CIA director.
It's amazing. So she can't even go into Europe.
But as far as like the Democrats having their fingerprints on the issue with Jerusalem recently, you also have Democrats and Hillary Clinton not coming out against Gina Haspel. So it's this neoliberal, centrist, Democrat establishment that is sort of going along with the aspects of Trump's presidency that benefits them, and benefits or is part of what they would have wanted to do anyway. So I think that's really interesting to see.
And I think that's the sad part. Like, I know people, complain and bitch and moan and everything else. And then you start thinking, well, what would Hillary Clinton have done? Would she have moved the embassy? Maybe, maybe not. There's no way to know. Maybe, but because she has this kind of close relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu also. She said she was more belligerent than Obama. I agree with you on this. Like, I think people get Trump based on his tone. And they sometimes forget that regardless of his tone, he's just governing like a Republican. Like the stuff that he's on. Mike Pence wouldn't be that much different than Trump, nor would Ted Cruz, nor would any of those guys be all that much different than what Donald Trump is doing in that office. He's just a batshit crazy Republican. Look, I don't know if Trump lied, or if Trump just didn't care, or if Trump was just powerless. I don't necessarily know which one it is.
Could be a combination.
Yeah, it could be some combination of all three. And I strongly suspect, though, that if you know that you don't have any kind of experience in a particular topic, like you're dealing with some kind of somebody says, Mr. President, XYZ is taking place around the world. What do you want to do? What he's going to go to his military advisors. What's he suggesting? Exactly. They're going to give him something. He's going to say, okay, well, this guy has a bunch of things on his shoulder. I'm a reality show host. Have at it. Even with the Syria thing. Like, and this is what I mean when I say powerless. I think he is powerless from the Syria standpoint up to a point. So you have a bomb that goes off. Well, supposedly there's a chemical strike. Supposedly, we don't necessarily know if it happened or not. Nobody been able to prove it, but it's supposedly a chemical strike. And Donald Trump fires the missiles. Doesn't think twice about it. But then he defunds white helmets. Like a few times later, he defunds white helmets. And the reason why I think he does this is because he realizes white helmets were the ones who came out with this. It was white helmets and social media that says it was a chemical strike. Well, that's pretty much all you got. When you talk to the people at the bottom, there, when some of the British press went there, they weren't able to necessarily find those people who that stuff happened to. And the Russian media even brought people out who said, this was the kid that was in the video, and this kid said it didn't happen. Now, it's possible that Russian media is propping that kid to do that, but it's also possible that, let's be honest, the American media or those people over there are propping them to behave that way too. So there's no way to know. It's hard to know. But they don't have a flat fact chemical strike that's taking place. And I would imagine if Donald Trump wants to focus his ire and attention on Iran, and he wants to be less hawkish in Syria, like he said, let's say for the moment his campaign promise was right. Well, you can't do that if you have this lingering indicator of white helmets that any random time they can fire it with chemical strike. Like, I think some of this stuff, he may be powerless from the standpoint of, if a chemical strike takes place, he's already said it's a red line, meaning from a political standpoint, he's captured by the politics of the moment. He has to strike. It doesn't really matter what he thinks. By the same token, yeah, you can defund the white helmets to try to prevent that chemical strike from happening again. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, I think some of the stuff, they go along with political win. Same thing with Sanders. So Sanders, when they would talk about the Russia stuff, Sanders would go along with the current as opposed to try to fight the current. Jill Stein, when he gets to current, her thing was, this is nonsense. I want to hold my shape. I think sometimes these guys get caught in the political current, and the thing becomes, is it easier to fight that current, or is it easier to just kind of go along with whatever the narrative is that mainstream media comes up with? I don't know. I'm curious about, look, I want the best for Assange, meaning I want him to come out this perfectly okay. And right now he's been in the embassy for what, 6 years?
Almost, yeah.
That's for all intents and purposes a prison by itself.
It's a prison without healthcare, because he and this is actually one of the things that I had forgotten to mention earlier that I think is really important that people understand. When you see people commenting on any status, Twitter update, whatever, in relation to Assange, and you see those hundreds of comments that are almost copy pasted, he can come out whenever he wants, or let him use the legal system and fight this bail issue. I want to remind people that a number of documents have been published by WikiLeaks publicly that show medical records of Assange that were done that were completed in, I believe, 2015. So that was years before this latest, isolation was put in place by the Ecuadorian government. Those medical records showed he was already suffering from the effects of solitary confinement, meaning he was suffering the same symptoms that people report when they've been through solitary confinement. So they shouldn't be you cannot downplay the isolation that's even worse now than it was then, and it's years later. But secondly, I think it's really important that people know that when Assange did go to prison at one point, or jail, I believe it was Wandsworth prison in the UK, and I may be wrong on that, somebody can correct me. But basically, what the medical records that published by WikiLeaks indicate is that he was actually given an object in his food, which then when he bit down on it, it broke his tooth because it was hidden in the food. So the reason that he even needs a dental procedure that he can't get for this broken tooth is because of what happened while he was in jail. So that, and that is written in those medical records, and it's just described as like,
I wouldn't be shocked if they did, but do you think, I guess there's no way to know, but I'm cynical, and I'm cynical of the stuff.
Understandably.
Because, when you see some of the stuff they do behind the scenes, like I give you a perfect example, Erdogan, and I don't mean to keep you much longer. Erdogan in Turkey shuts down the internet. He shuts down the internet because they're caught talking about a false flag in Syria using Al-Qaeda as this kind of framework that would allow them to essentially do these attacks in Syria. saying, look, don't worry about the reasoning. We can come up with the reason using Al-Qaeda as a framework for these attacks. And then Erdogan finds, people, it comes out that these guys are planting a false flag. It shuts down the internet, saying it's villainous that these people expose the fact that I'm trying to do some kind of, nasty stuff abroad. And that's not just Turkey. I mean, that's governments. Like, governments behave in this way. Now, if you wanted to try to find a way to either punish somebody or to get somebody in a situation where they may need something, meaning medical treatment, well, people need medical treatment. If your tooth is hurting, you need dental work.
Exactly.
Would it be a scenario where something like that takes place in order to kind of force the issue, try to force
exactly
to get those
definitely things? I absolutely no. I think a lot of people have pointed out that they are trying to withhold that medical care because he also needs an MRI scan for his shoulder, which is injured. There's a whole host of other reasons that this is an untenable situation. But yes, I think that is like a slow method of torture to have somebody in untreatable pain in a condition that needs treatment. And that is definitely something that I think they want, is to force him out through either psychological or physical, pain that is just unbearable for any human being. But I think Assange is also very, very strong. I don't think that this is somebody who is easily, scared out of anything. And so I think that if anybody can withstand this type of attack, it's him. But yes, I think that that's one method of attack that they are trying to use against him, for sure.
3 last questions. The European Court of Justice, does it apply? And if so, and if not, why not? Like, I mean, technically, Britain is still within the EU. I mean, the ECJ still applies, I would imagine. And if I'm not mistaken, it supersedes British law if you're talking about European issues. He's in Britain. The UN has kind of made this ruling saying, let him go. You guys are holding them there illegally.
Definitely.
Does the ECJ have anything, or have they had anything to say about his, I guess you can call it, involuntary detention for all this time?
Yeah, the UN just, I think twice, labeled his Julian Assange's situation as arbitrary detention.
No, not the ECJ, the European
Court.
No,
I understand. I'm just prefacing by saying that the United Nations working group on arbitrary detention did find that he was being arbitrarily detained.
Okay.
To then say, I'm not aware of any finding or ruling by the group that you're talking about. I'm also not a legal mind, and I'm definitely not, a member of Assange's legal counsel. But if there is any ruling by him that's favorable, then I hope that would stand. Whether it's already happened or in the future, if in the future that type of situation does happen, then I would definitely hope that would be respected. But as we have seen, the UK does not respect international law when it comes to this case. Referring to the fact that they didn't respect the fact that Ecuador made him not only a citizen but a diplomat and gave him that diplomatic immunity. So, I hope that some sort of international law is able to help Assange, but I don't trust the UK and the US to respect those types of laws.
No, I don't either. Because what's the consequence? I mean, it's like, even if they, arrest them, what's the consequence? There's no consequence. There's never a consequence. How is Susie Dawson? I was asked to ask that from Jay Scott.
Yeah, basically, Susie is as well as can be expected. She's out of, danger, and she is recovering, and I think she'll be just fine. I think she's going to be do just fine. Her financial situation is still really, really precarious, and so she really appreciates donations because she's not able to use any sort of public health care because she's an asylum seeker in Russia. She also cannot work in Russia and earn money. So because of that,
Russia? I didn't know she was in Russia. I thought she was New Zealand. I thought she was a New Zealand citizen.
She is. She is a New Zealander who is now in Russia. She's seeking asylum in Russia. And that's a very long story in and of itself. But basically, because of that situation, she's not able to work. So she's not able to earn money from while in Russia. And so because of that, this whole illness is going to be really difficult for her to get through. So for that reason, she really appreciates donations. But as far as her health goes, I think she's much, much better at this point. She's not in the critical situation that she was just recently. So, and
the last one, Nico House. I saw an article that was written about Nico House. What's going on with him?
Basically, I believe it was almost a week ago now, Nico House wrote a heartbreaking post on Twitter where he described repeated wrongful arrest and beatings by police that were part of, repeated experiences of systematic and racism that was absolutely ingrained in especially some local Georgia police forces in local counties, because he was arrested multiple times in this one small area. But it was really, really distressing for everybody who read it. And he has a GoFundMe page that basically is trying to raise funds to help him pay rent because of the fact that he's had to pay a huge amount of money for these really wrongful, not even charges, but just wrongful events that have happened, including events that have put him in the hospital. So basically, Nico spoke to Tim Black. They had a great conversation, and then also we at Disobedient Media spoke to Nico, and he talked to us about this situation that has been just repeated. And so we decided to write about it because it's really important to cover these stories. And I really hope that others in the independent media will also cover Nico's story, because, he is an absolutely amazing, intelligent person. And, he was an instigator in the DNC fraud lawsuit. He has done so much for other people. And so I hope other people will support him too, because he, amazing person.
Cool. All right. I'm going to end it here. I've kept you like an hour, and I've bugged the shit out of you, even talking about aliens. So
no, it's fine. Totally fine.
So thank you very much for coming on. I like I said, I think this is a mind-blowing story, and to some degree, heartbreaking story. Like, I don't know Julian Assange, but for the last 10 years or more, we've used his information to process our reality, if we're being honest. I mean, especially with, like you said, talking about independent media, where we're looking at, like, you think of all of these little documents that you come up with, all of these little bits of information, and a lot of those bits of information are coming something from WikiLeaks. It's amazing. So thank you very much for keeping your pulse on this. Elizabeth Lea Vos, Disobedient Media, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always an honor. Thank you.
No, I appreciate it. Let me see. So this is Balthazar 228, Greater Transparency - Obama Jails Whistleblowers. That's funny and sad.
Yeah.
Balthazar 228. If May resigned, could PM Corbyn pardon him? Oh, that's interesting. So if the government collapsed, say for example, they can't get a deal with Northern Ireland, the DUP, said they're done. The government of Britain implodes. Jeremy Corbyn becomes prime minister.
That would be amazing.
Would he have the capacity to say, let him out, he's free to go?
I don't know. I'm not legally trained, and I'm especially not like familiar with the UK legal system, but I would hope so. And I'm not sure about the politics.
I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say yes.
I hope so, though. I really do.
The reason why I say that is another UFO case. There's a British cat. He's not a kid anymore. He used to be a kid. Everybody used to be a kid, but there's this British cat who was listening to what was he talking about? Greer. I don't know you, Stephen Greer. Stephen Greer is somewhat of a goofball, and not fully goofball. I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean he talks about himself constantly. If Stephen Greer gave like an hour lecture, 45 minutes would just be how awesome he is. But he has these things where he does these interviews where he's talking to people who've been in these different industries. One of the guys, one of the women he was talking to was someone who used to work for NASA. So the guy, he's a British citizen. He hears this lecture and he says, wow, if what this woman is saying is true, this is mind blowing. And he takes on the task of start hacking into these agencies. Now, what he finds is he doesn't really have to hack into them because the password is like password 1, something like that. It's like something stupid. And it's like these.
It's amazing. The arrogance, though, that they feel safe making those ridiculous passwords is amazing. Like, absolutely amazing.
He said he was like, they act like I'm some massive hacker. He says it was like password 1 or something. It was like some like just basic stuff.
Like John Podesta's like password with A as the @ symbol. Like, yeah.
Really. Yeah, it was something like that, right? So it was something that is mundane that he was able to get into. And he starts looking through these files and piecing through the information. And he's doing this for like weeks on end or something like that. And finally, one day, somebody catches him. And he says somebody sends him a note back saying, who are you? And what are you doing in the system? In which case, he's like, oh, holy shit. He's like shutting everything down. But at that point, it's too late. The cops end up coming to his house. And they try to extradite him. They literally tried to extradite him from the United States because of what he was into and what he was watching. And he comes out saying, there's some insane stuff in some of those files. Now, the catch to this is David Cameron refused the extradition. David Cameron said, no, I'm not extraditing to the United States. There was this big push, especially by his mom, to try to keep him in the country and try to refuse the order. And it went on for months, and eventually David Cameron refused that extradition order. I would think that Jeremy Corbyn would be able to say, no, I'm not going to allow the British cops to lock this man up. I'm going to allow this man to go to Ecuador. That's what I would think.
I would hope so too. I would hope so too. I definitely think he would do that. I just don't know that especially the U.S. intelligence community would respect that. I think, but I do think that if he said something like that, what it would do actually, it would be really great. It would force them to show their hand. It would force them to show how little they respect the legal systems of both countries and the international law, and it would show us how desperate they are to get Assange.
That will be mind-blowing. I mean, right now there is already an international incident that's taking place where the United States is talking about putting sanctions on British and European companies. Like that's mind-blowing. Like, think about this. They're supposed to be one of our closest allies in the world, meaning Europe, and the United States has allied itself with one government that's murdering Yemenis and starving Yemenis and, weaponizing illness, and another government that's out there murdering protesters who are with nothing, unarmed protesters. Whereas the European allies are sticking with the Iran deal because they say Iran didn't break the deal. And the United States government has told them, we will sanction your businesses if you do business with Iran. Like, this is mind-blowing. Like, this is international politics in this major way. Yeah. But you have European countries who have no idea what to do with this because they're like, is the United States serious? Are they really going to sanction our businesses? And if so, how do we protect ourselves? We've been so accustomed to sticking with Big Brother United States through thick and thin, and now that boot is on our throats. This is fascinating.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it goes back again to that quote by Wesley Clark years and years ago, where he gave a list of like 7 countries that they were going to take over. Obviously we've seen that happen in Libya, Afghanistan, and Iraq, but we haven't seen, Iran go down yet. But this definitely shows, though, the severity or the degree to which the American intelligence community and military interests really feel like they are the absolute, not just the police force of the world, but that they, as you mentioned, like, are they really going to sanction us? They really expect everyone to go along with that. And if you even so much as, don't go along with them in one little small part of it, then you have this massive, like, overreaction. And I think that really says a lot about the American military interests, more than it does about the EU or Iran. I think that says a lot about them. But
yeah. I'm fascinated by this because I don't have the sense. I mean, if the United States ends up sanctioning British or German companies, oh God, that's going to be a fuck fest. Like, oh geez. But on the positive side, it would make Europe more independent, which is a positive thing, and not necessarily go along with each and everything that the United States does. That may be a positive, but I don't know how it's going to turn out. Balthazar, when you drain the swamp, you reveal the monsters. Lord Jesus, you're right. I'm winning the denial phase from Hillary Clinton and Charlie Sheen. Oh, that's hilarious. Let's see. Is there anybody else? That may be it. Oh, there's one more. Free Assange. Hot damn. Hope K. I agree. Hope K. Alrighty. Elizabeth Lea Vos, thank you very much. Guys, Disobedient Media, Elizabeth Lea Vos. She is awesome.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, guys. I'm going to end this. They're joking me. They're saying he's not going to let her go. We'll let you go. All right, guys. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. And of course, you guys can always support through Patreon. Thanks, everyone. All right.
Bye.